He walked into the embassy and said, "I'm Sergeant David M. Langley, United States Army. Am I still at war?" Jakarta, Indonesia, April 4, 1989. The security guard thought the man was a vagrant at first. Dirty uniform, boots held together by twine, a face half covered by beard, skin like leather, eyes guarded but focused. He didn't speak the local language, just handed over a folded, yellowed piece of paper and said one thing, in clear but dry English, "I need to speak to the United States government." Inside that paper was a faded copy of a military ID, U.S. Army Pacific Theater, serial number 3744216. Name, Langley, David M. Rank, Sergeant. Issue date, April 2, 1944. The Marines at the embassy thought it was a joke, a hoax. Maybe someone playing on old urban legends. But the man was calm. He waited, sat upright, didn't blink. "I was stationed on Morotai in 1945, he said. "My unit was hit. I was separated. I've been waiting. For orders," he replied. "Has the war ended yet?" The air went still. It had been 44 years since World War II ended. 44 years since America declared victory over Japan. 44 years since Sergeant David M. Langley had been officially listed as killed in action. And yet here he was, alive, in the flesh, sitting in a U.S. embassy, and asking if the war was still going on. The call to Washington came immediately. State Department, Defense Department, Veterans Affairs, all of them scrambling to verify what couldn't be possible. Langley's file said he had died on May 18, 1945, during a Japanese counterattack on the northern coast of Morotai, a small but strategically important island in the Dutch East Indies. According to the report, his remains were unrecoverable. A memorial service had been held in his hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. A gold star was placed in his family's window, his name engraved on a wall of honor. But now, 44 years later, a man bearing that name, that face, and that serial number had walked out of the jungle, unchanged in his loyalty, yet completely forgotten. He was immediately flown to Hawaii, then to Washington. Medical tests confirmed the impossible. DNA matched a living cousin. Scars from shrapnel wounds aligned with records. And most chilling of all, his fingerprints were still on file. From his enlistment in 1942, there was no doubt. This was him. The man America had buried. When asked where he had been all these years, Langley didn't hesitate. "In the jungle," he said. "Morotai, later moved inland, near the mountains." He'd survived off fruit, hunted wild pigs, bartered with local fishermen. He built his own shelter, sharpened bamboo spears, kept his rifle oiled and ready. For 4 decades, he remained in hiding, not out of fear, but duty. "The war didn't end," he insisted. "No one told me. I was trained to hold my ground until relieved." He had tried to signal planes once or twice, but feared Japanese tricks, propaganda that lured soldiers out only to ambush them. When asked why he finally stepped out in 1989, he said, "I saw a transistor radio, a news broadcast, in English. They mentioned President Reagan. That was the first time I believed it might be over." And so, after 44 years of silence, he came home. But coming home wasn't as simple as boarding a plane. There was no family left. His parents had passed in the 1960s. His younger brother, a Marine, had been killed in Korea. The house he grew up in had been bulldozed for a parking lot. He was a hero, with nowhere to go. The military gave him a temporary apartment near Arlington, issued him back pay, adjusted for inflation, and offered a full dress burial, should he want it. But Langley declined. "I've already buried myself once," he said. "Don't do it again." The newspapers called him the lost soldier, the man who missed the end of the war. But for Langley, it wasn't about being lost. It was about doing what he was told, about believing in the system longer than the system believed in him. And when reporters asked him if he was angry, he simply said, "No, I was never abandoned. I was just unread." But behind that calm was something deeper, a sadness, a question he never said aloud. Because while the world moved on, he hadn't. He had been frozen in 1945, while the country he served had quietly erased him. And then, weeks after his return, someone brought him a folder. Inside it, a memo. Dated July 1946, classified. Marked, unconfirmed survivor spotted north of Morotai. Recommendation, no pursuit, cost outweighs recovery. He stared at it, didn't speak, just folded it once, and walked away. Some stories end with parades, some with medals. But this one began with a knock at a gate, and a question that still echoes. Am I still at war? They told his family he died on May 18, 1945. It was a telegram, delivered to a small house in Omaha, Nebraska, the kind with gold lettering and ice-cold language. We regret to inform you that your son, Sergeant David M. Langley, has been killed in action during combat operations in the South Pacific. His sacrifice is noted with honor. His mother collapsed in the hallway. His father didn't speak for 3 days. A neighbor helped sew the gold star into the window curtain. The local church held a memorial. The town built a plaque. And just like that, his life was closed. No body was recovered, but the report was clear. Death confirmed during enemy engagement, presumed unrecoverable. No questions asked, no follow-up mission, no one returned to the jungle. Because the war was ending, resources were stretched thin, and one missing name in 1,000 was easy to bury. When Langley returned in 1989, the Department of the Army dusted off his file. It was 27 pages, half of them typed with a ribbon machine, a few handwritten notes, some stamped forms. Page 6 was where everything changed. It stated, subject engaged during counterattack at grid reference 18QX274992. Blast radius consistent with artillery. Subject presumed dead due to direct impact. No physical remains recovered. Presumed. That word appeared 9 times in the file. Presumed KIA. Presumed unrecoverable. Presumed location unsearchable. But there was something missing. No eyewitness confirmation, no signature from the field medic, no photographic evidence. Only one signature. A lieutenant who, records showed, left the unit 4 days before the incident. Langley's death was signed off by a man who wasn't even there. And then came the memo, dated July 1, 1946, more than a year after Langley was declared dead. It read, local scout team operating in North Morotai reported sighting of American male in military gear. Subject fled upon approach. Language barrier prevented confirmation. No further investigation deemed necessary. In the margin, a note. Cost of pursuit exceeds benefit. Recommend no action, case closed. It was cold, bureaucratic, final, and it changed everything because it meant someone saw him and chose not to bring him home. Back in Omaha, Langley's surviving niece, born after his disappearance, read the file with shaking hands. I grew up thinking Uncle David was a ghost, she said. Now I realize he was just abandoned. Journalists tried to track down the officer who signed the final report. He died in 1978. His personal papers were sealed. His family refused interviews. But one letter, found in a university archive, showed a haunting postscript. Some things from the war were easier to forget than fix. In press conferences, the Army insisted all decisions made at the time were in accordance with wartime field standards. Given the information available, the declaration of KIA was not unreasonable. But for Langley, it wasn't about reasonable. It was about being left behind. While his country moved on. I wasn't angry, he said in his first televised interview, but I wasn't dead either. And for a moment, the world saw what happens when a soldier survives. But the paperwork doesn't. Now, a new question began to rise. If Sergeant Langley could be forgotten, buried in a file based on assumptions, how many others were buried the same way? They called him a ghost. But ghosts don't survive alone in the jungle for 44 years. So who kept him alive? His name was Rafi, a fisherman's son from the northern coast of Morotai. In 1945, Rafi was 12. He remembered the sound of war, bombs, gunfire, foreign boots crushing the underbrush. Then one day, after the shelling had quieted, he found something strange near a small creek. A man, bleeding, dirty, holding a rifle. The boy ran, but the man didn't shoot. He didn't shout. He just raised one hand and whispered one word. Friend. Rafi had heard of American soldiers, stories from villagers, rumors from radio waves. He didn't know who this man was or why he was alone. But something in the man's eyes made him stop. That night, Rafi brought food, a handful of fruit, water in a coconut shell. The next night, more. Days became weeks, then years. Their friendship didn't grow through conversation. Langley spoke only English. Rafi only Ternatian, but through ritual, repetition, and survival. They built a language of hands and eyes, of trust forged in silence. Langley taught Rafi how to clean and fire a weapon. Rafi showed Langley how to catch fish with bamboo traps. In time, the soldier became a ghost to everyone else. But to Rafi, he became something more. He was my second father, Rafi would later say. He never shouted, never harmed anyone. He watched the world like a hawk, always listening, always waiting. Waiting for what? Orders, Langley said, decades later. I was never relieved of duty. When Rafi tried to tell him the war was over, that no planes came anymore, that the Japanese had left, Langley only shook his head. Propaganda, he muttered. They want me to break. I was trained better than that. And so he stayed. Hidden, alert, rifle by his side. A uniform that rotted and was stitched back together more times than could be counted. Rafi kept his secret, even from his own family. I was afraid, he said, afraid that if others knew, they would hurt him, or worse, take him away. Years passed. Rafi became a man, married, had children. But once a week, every week, he brought supplies to the same hidden shelter deep in the hills. And Langley waited. And the world forgot. Until 1989, when Rafi's youngest son brought home a radio. Langley sat beside it, listened to English voices for the first time in decades. Reagan. Cold War, space shuttle, AIDS, Wall Street, Beatles. The world had not just changed, it had rebuilt itself. Langley was silent for hours, then days. Finally, he told Rafi, I need to go. I think it's time. Rafi walked him to the edge of the jungle, pressed a pouch of coins into his hand, and cried. The embassy staff who received Langley never knew this part of the story. They never asked who kept him alive, who helped him believe in something long after the orders stopped coming. But when a journalist tracked down Rafi in 1992, his words were simple. I didn't save him, he said. He saved me. He reminded me what it means to be loyal, even when the world forgets you. Not all heroes wear uniforms. Some wear patience. Some carry secrets. Some keep a stranger alive in silence for 44 years, without ever asking for anything in return. He came home a national mystery. A man lost in time, reborn in headlines. The soldier who never surrendered. Back from the jungle. The war is over, but not for him. The news crews camped outside the Veterans Hospital in Hawaii. Reporters followed him through the airport in D.C., snapping photos of a man in oversized loner clothes and government-issued sneakers. They asked him about the jungle, the isolation, the survival. He answered politely, but never elaborated. They wanted a myth. He was still just a soldier. The Pentagon issued a formal statement. Sergeant David M. Langley is hereby reinstated posthumously to active status as of May 18, 1945, with full back pay and benefits adjusted to present day. We thank him for his service and recognize his extraordinary endurance. They handed him a check. They handed him a medal. They handed him a flag, the second he'd received in his lifetime. But they didn't hand him a home. His family was gone. The house where he grew up was now a gas station. The church where his funeral had been held was shuttered. The street he once marched down in uniform bore no memory of him. The world had moved on, without him. And he had no map for where to start again. They gave him a small apartment near Arlington. A caseworker helped file paperwork. He was eligible for Social Security but had never paid into the system during his lost years. They gave him a new ID, a new Social Security number. They offered counseling. He declined. "They mean well," he told a journalist, "but I don't know how to talk about nothing." Langley tried to adjust. He went for walks at dawn, like he used to on patrol. He folded his bed sheets tight each morning, hospital-cornered and precise. He carried his spoon in his pocket out of habit. He lined his shoes by the door, 2 inches apart. Neighbors found him kind but odd. Children stared. One vet offered a salute. Langley returned it, crisp and exact. But mostly, he was quiet, watching, listening, always waiting for a command that would never come. One afternoon, a young officer visited him, a favor from the department. He was polite, curious. "Sergeant Langley," he said, "what kept you alive out there? What made you stay?" Langley looked at the wall. There was no photo, no flag, just light. Then he replied, "I didn't know I had permission to leave." That sentence hung in the air for a long time, because it wasn't just about duty. It was about something deeper, something broken. He had been trained to follow orders. But no one told him the war was over. No one came to relieve him. No one came to find him. So he stayed. He stayed while presidents came and went, while man walked on the moon, while the Cold War flared and faded, while a nation grieved wars he never fought in, because he was still stuck in the first. In the years that followed, Langley received thousands of letters, veterans, civilians, historians. Some called him a hero, others questioned the story. A few accused the government of using him as a symbol. But Langley never answered. He didn't care about the myth, only the mission. And the mission had ended, without anyone telling him. One night, his caseworker stopped by to check on him. Langley sat at the table, quiet, his boots by the door. On the table was a folded uniform, carefully pressed. Next to it, a slip of paper. A simple line written in pencil. Duty fulfilled. Standing down. He was still alive, just ready. He had survived war, jungle, silence, memory. But coming home, that was the hardest part. In 1945, Sergeant David M. Langley went missing in combat, and within 6 weeks the military stopped looking. Not because they found his body, not because the case was resolved, but because of 2 words typed at the bottom of a report: presumed dead. It was a choice. The last known communication from Langley's unit was a chaotic radio message during a Japanese counterattack on Morotai Island. Langley was separated during the retreat. Visibility was low. The terrain was dense, unforgiving. The enemy, unpredictable. Search patrols were conducted for 2 days. Then came the order: disengage. The war was ending. Men were needed elsewhere. The casualty list was already too long, and one missing sergeant wouldn't change the outcome of the Pacific Theater. So the search was called off. His status changed to MIA. Then, 1 month later, KIA. When his parents asked if recovery efforts would continue, the Army replied, "Due to ongoing operations and strategic shifts, additional deployment of personnel is not possible at this time. We extend our deepest sympathies." It sounded official, measured, grateful. But behind the language was a truth harder to accept. They didn't believe he was alive. And worse, they didn't need him to be. In wartime, the line between missing and dead can be thin, not just on paper, but in priority. Declaring a soldier dead ends the paperwork. It closes the file. It stops the questions. It spares the government further cost. And in the case of Langley, the decision fit the narrative. He was young, enlisted, low-ranking, no political connections. And his loss came at a time when America was already preparing its victory parade. So the machine moved on, without him. But the story doesn't end with a bureaucratic stamp. Because years later, in a box of forgotten archives, someone found a memo. Dated February 1946, stamped "Confidential," addressed to Central Command Pacific. The subject line: unconfirmed report of isolated American soldier in interior Moritai region. A scouting unit had intercepted a story from locals, a foreigner living in the hills, carrying a rifle, speaking English, avoiding contact. The memo included a hand-drawn map, coordinates, an estimate of the area to be searched, and then, at the bottom, in red ink, request denied, no strategic value. No strategic value. That was the reason they didn't go, not because they didn't believe, but because bringing him home wouldn't make headlines. One military historian later said, "In 1946, America was focused on repatriating prisoners of war, stabilizing Japan, and preparing for the Cold War. There was no appetite to chase shadows in the jungle, even if those shadows were ours. The Army had a number. 1 million casualties. One war to close. One less search to fund. Langley had become an acceptable loss. And yet, someone had tried." A lieutenant who had served with Langley sent a letter in 1947 urging higher command to reopen the search. He never received a reply. His memo was found decades later, unread, unanswered, filed in a folder labeled "Final Disposition, Non-Recoverable." Langley's name was chiseled into stone, folded into flags, buried in reports. And no one came looking, because no one was supposed to. The jungle kept him alive, but the system kept him gone. For 44 years, David Langley had listened to only two things: wind in the trees, and the silence between wars. The jungle was his world. His mission was his anchor. His orders were clear: hold position until relieved. No relief ever came, so he stayed. Every sound meant danger. Every movement could be a trap. He boiled his water, cleaned his weapon weekly, slept with one eye open, a soldier in an endless war that only he remembered. But then, one morning in late 1988, Rafi's youngest son brought home a radio. It was small, dusty, tuned to a station out of Manado, mostly static, crackling between bursts of unfamiliar music. Langley had no interest in it at first. He had learned to distrust anything new. But one night, as rain fell heavy and the jungle curled into itself, he sat beside the device, turned the dial, slowly, carefully, and then a voice. Clear, calm, unmistakably American. President Reagan met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev today. Langley froze. He looked around the hut. No one moved. He leaned closer. Latest updates on the Challenger investigation. Wall Street closes at a new high. Super Bowl WWII, just weeks away. He didn't recognize the names. The world had shifted. Events, leaders, even sports. Foreign to a man trapped in 1945. He thought it was a trick. "I assumed it was Japanese propaganda," he later said. "They used recordings during the war, tried to make us break discipline. But this voice didn't mock. It didn't preach surrender. It just reported life." And that's what shook him. Not the facts, but the normalcy. The voice didn't sound like war. It sounded like peacetime. He listened all night, didn't sleep, didn't blink. By morning, something inside him had shifted. The foundation cracked. The doubt crept in. For weeks, he returned to the radio like a man checking a wound. Each time the voice came back, saying things no propaganda officer could invent. American presidents he'd never heard of. Wars he didn't fight in. Songs with rhythms he couldn't follow. Prices he didn't understand. The war was over. Not last week, not last year, for decades, and no one had told him. He didn't speak for 3 days. Rafi thought he was ill. But when he brought food, Langley finally looked up and said one word: finished. That night, he packed his things. What little remained: an old rifle, a stitched uniform, a rusted dog tag that had turned green with time. He didn't take souvenirs, no diary, no trophies, only duty. He asked Rafi to take him to the coast, to the nearest town with a government building, anywhere with a flag. When Rafi asked if he was afraid, Langley shook his head. "I've been afraid for 44 years, he said. "I'm tired of waiting for someone else to say I can go home." The journey took 2 days. Boats. Dirt roads. Long pauses under wide skies. Langley didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Because somewhere in his chest, orders had finally changed, and he was ready to stand down. At the U.S. Embassy gate in Jakarta, when the guard asked his name, Langley straightened his spine, met his eyes, and answered the only way he knew how. "Sergeant David M. Langley, United States Army, reporting for debrief." The plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base on a foggy morning in May 1989. 2 soldiers stood by the tarmac. A staff car waited near the hangar. No parade, no press, no crowd. Just silence. The kind that doesn't honor, but hesitates. He stepped off wearing loaned civilian clothes, a pair of army boots scuffed from the jungle, and a folded American flag tucked under one arm. The same one the Army had given his parents in 1945. It had come full circle. The man they buried had come back. He was led into a waiting room, then into a medical exam. Doctors poked and tested, measured and scanned. He passed every check. No severe illness, no mental breakdown, no memory loss. Just one question the psychiatrist kept repeating. "Why didn't you leave the jungle?" And always, the same answer. "No one told me to." The Pentagon issued a short statement. Sergeant David M. Langley has been identified, verified, and fully reinstated to active status until formal discharge proceedings are complete. The department recognizes his service. But that was it. No medals, no welcome home, no names from the past. Just a file reopened, updated, and quietly stamped. Returned. They assigned him an apartment near Arlington National Cemetery. 1 bedroom, a folding chair, a kitchenette. He hung nothing on the walls. The VA gave him a caseworker. She was kind, young, tried to help. He asked her once if they still issued ration books. She didn't know what to say. He walked the city sometimes. DC looked nothing like he remembered. And everything like a dream gone wrong. Buildings taller, streets louder, money different. Everyone staring into tiny glowing screens. Flags everywhere, but few salutes. One afternoon, he stopped in front of a war memorial. His name was carved into it. He ran his fingers across the cold stone. Beneath his name, "Killed in Action, May 18th, 1945. He stood there for 20 minutes, then walked away without a word. The press tried to revive interest, but the news cycle moved on. There were no new photos, no dramatic twists. Just a quiet man sitting by a window watching traffic. A man out of time. A journalist from the Washington Post asked him, "What do you miss most about the world before?" Langley answered without blinking. "Certainty," he said. "You knew where you stood back then, even when it hurt." He received hundreds of letters. Some thanked him. Some called him a hoax. A few asked if he found God in the jungle. He answered none. But every now and then, he would take out a pencil and write in a notebook, 1 line at a time. No one ever saw what it said. He lived simply, ate early, slept light. He kept his uniform pressed, his boots polished, and his dog tags on the nightstand. But mostly, he kept to himself. Not because he was bitter, but because the world he came back to wasn't the one he fought for. Some called him a legend. Some said he was a mistake corrected too late. But for David Langley, it was simpler than that. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a hero. He was a soldier. And now, finally, he was waiting for nothing. The Army called it a routine review. But everyone knew what it was. The return of Sergeant David M. Langley, 44 years after being declared dead, was not just unexpected, it was embarrassing. Embarrassing for the clerks who closed the file, for the officers who dismissed the search, for the system that buried a man without proof. So they opened an inquiry, not to find out what happened, but to explain why they shouldn't be blamed for it. The Pentagon assembled a small task force. 6 officers, 1 historian. No one from Langley's original unit. They requested access to all wartime records, search reports, and casualty assessments related to Langley's disappearance in 1945. The findings came quickly. Too quickly. Within 4 weeks, the task force issued a summary. At the time of Sergeant Langley's presumed death, all procedures followed were in accordance with field standards and available intelligence. His survival, while extraordinary, could not have been reasonably anticipated. The classification of KIA was justified under the operational conditions of the period. Justified. That word rang hollow. Official, legal, safe, but not right. Langley was never asked to testify. He was never brought into a meeting room, never invited to read the summary, never given a chance to speak. He only learned about the investigation when a reporter mailed him a clipping from the Stars and Stripes military paper. Headline: Army Review, No Fault in Langley Case. He folded the article, slipped it under his coffee cup. Didn't say a word. But not everyone stayed quiet. A former records officer, now retired, sent Langley a letter. It began: I was part of the unit that processed your KIA paperwork in '45. I remember your name. I remember the moment we stamped it. I didn't fight it. And I think about it every night. Another, a general long since out of uniform, wrote, You became inconvenient. Not intentionally, just statistically. You weren't a scandal, you were a box to check. And now I wonder how many more boxes we filled the same way. Langley read the letters. All of them. But he never responded. Meanwhile, the Office of Military Accountability submitted an internal memo to Congress recommending a reevaluation of over 100 presumed death cases from World War II and Korea. Most were dismissed. Some reopened. None as public as Langley's. The truth was simple. His case made headlines. The others never did. In one closed-door hearing, a Pentagon aide reportedly said, Langley was an anomaly, a ghost that walked out of the jungle. We can't build policy around exceptions. Another responded, He wasn't the exception. He was the proof we stopped looking too soon. That line never made it into the transcript. Back in his apartment, Langley kept to routine. He still shaved at 0500, still polished his boots, still cleaned the single bullet he kept from the war, the one he never had to use. When asked what he thought about the investigation, he said, I wasn't looking for an apology, just someone to admit they closed the book before the last page. That admission never came. But the guilt lived on, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in footnotes, in redacted reports, and in the quiet letters from men who knew they got it wrong. Men who wore stars, but never bore the cost. Langley had survived the jungle, but in the end, it wasn't survival they couldn't explain. It was why no one had gone back to find him. And maybe that's why the truth still stings. Because sometimes, guilt isn't loud. It's a whisper in a file drawer. And the weight of one name carved too early into stone. By the time the investigation closed, by the time the cameras left, and the newspapers moved on, Sergeant David M. Langley had been alive. Again, for 3 years. And still the question lingered. Not in the halls of the Pentagon, not in the pages of official reports, but in the minds of those who had watched him return and say nothing. The question was simple, deceptively so. Why did he stay? Why, after the war ended, after the shooting stopped, after the world forgot, did David Langley keep fighting a war that no longer existed? And worse, why did no one go back for him? The system had explanations, logistics, priorities, miscommunication. Fog of war, they called it. But none of those things explained the silence. The silence of the men who filed his death report without a body. The silence of commanders who read field sightings and did nothing. The silence that wrapped around his name and hardened into stone, because the truth was uncomfortable. He wasn't supposed to come back. One military analyst wrote in a post-war review, Langley's return disrupts the efficiency of the narrative. In war, we bury the dead quickly, sometimes for good reason. To remember, everyone is to reopen every failure. A line later redacted. Too honest for a final draft. Langley never asked for a stage, never sought revenge, never demanded justice. But still, the question followed him. Why didn't someone try harder? Why didn't they look again? Why wasn't one loyal soldier worth the cost of one more search? He never asked these things aloud, but the people around him felt it, in the way he paused when someone saluted, in the way he looked at war memorials as if trying to remember which version of him was buried, in the way he called the jungle home and America, the place I report to now. One evening, his caseworker, the same young woman who'd helped him navigate paperwork, grocery forms, rent assistance, found him sitting in the small courtyard behind his apartment. He looked tired. Not ill, not weak, just done. She asked him, "Do you ever regret coming back?" He took a long time to answer. Then he said, "No, I just wish I knew what I came back to." Because the war ended, but no one told him. The world moved on, but no one brought him along. And when he came home, he found a country that didn't know what to do with a man who never stopped serving. The army gave him ribbons, the nation gave him headlines, the people gave him questions. But none of them gave him the one thing he'd been waiting for since 1945, someone to say, "You're done now, Sergeant. You did your part. You can rest." No one said that, so he kept waiting, not for orders, not for answers, but for someone, anyone, to ask the only question that mattered. Did we deserve him? David M. Langley died on a Tuesday. No ceremony, no last words, no bugle, just the rustling of spring leaves through a narrow window and a folded flag at the foot of his bed. He was 85. He died of heart failure, alone, in his apartment, still wearing his army t-shirt. When the landlord unlocked the door, they found him sitting upright in his chair. His boots were polished, his belt lined neatly across the table, and next to him, his old helmet, dented and faded, resting on a sheet of paper. On it, 10 words written in careful, steady hand. Mission held. No relief sent. Standing down on own. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a report. The last one. The Army offered a funeral at Arlington. Full honors, gun salute, flag detail. They expected no one would come, but they were wrong. The story had been told too many times. In newspapers, in whispered military circles, in classrooms, and on that cloudy Friday morning, over 200 people came, veterans who'd never met him. Children who'd studied his story. A few aging officers who had once signed papers they now regretted. And Rafi, the boy from the jungle, now an old man, stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. He brought nothing but a flower, and a promise he'd kept for 44 years. He said nothing, but his presence said everything. Langley was buried with a crisp salute, a final roll call, a folded flag placed into no one's hands, because he had no living family. The flag remained on the casket, a silent symbol of a man who gave his loyalty freely and never got the world to say, "We see you." But in that moment, as the last shot echoed across the field, someone finally did. Not with fanfare, not with a speech. Just one whispered line, spoken by a young soldier as the casket lowered. "We don't deserve him, but we'll remember him." And maybe that's all he ever wanted. Not medals, not apology, not fame, just memory. Just someone who wouldn't forget. Just one person who'd whisper his name into the silence. Because in the end, Sergeant David M. Langley wasn't the last soldier of World War II. He was something rarer. A man who kept faith with his country, even after his country lost faith in him. He saluted until the end. And maybe now, finally, he's been relieved. Closing note for viewers. If this story moved you, if it made you think, then don't let it end here. Tell someone about Sergeant Langley. Share his name. Keep his service alive. Not in stone, but in memory. Leave a comment with what you would have said to him. Subscribe to this channel for more untold stories. And always remember, history forgets who we let it forget. But memory is a choice.